all of you have been invited at the instance of PUCL Maharashtra, which is hosting this meeting.
What is very interesting about this book, it is, I suppose one can divide it into two parts, the colonial period and the period after independence. And as far as the colonial period goes, you know, there are a lot of myths about this colonial period and the question of caste. The fact that in our constitution we declared untouchability to be abolished. Later on we have had other laws on caste as well. Then there is also a view that many Dalit Bahujans recognize, going back to the time of Mahatma Phule, that in fact the coming of the British at the time when they did come, when for example the Peshwas were in power in what is now Maharashtra, and in a period when Shudras and Dalits were subjected to the worst kind of exploitation and humiliation. And in fact, the coming of the British opened the doors a little bit to some kind of reform. Because there were many among the British rulers who expressed alarm at the practice of caste. But actually the engagement of the British with the question of caste has been quite complex, and I think it is this complexity that this book brings out very well. And it is, I think it also brings home to us that it is not as if the problem is the problem of Dalits, who are the marginalized among the castes, who are in fact called the Avarnas, who don't even fit into the four Varna structure. But it is a question of the caste system as a whole. And then the book starts off, of course, very interestingly with a form of punishment which was practiced in England, in what is now the United Kingdom, a practice of punishing people by putting them in stocks, you know, confining their movement in a very cruel way. And when the British came here, they thought that this was a punishment suitable for the working classes, who very often were of the lower castes. And it was only some time later that the British themselves thought this should be stopped. But during this period, what also came up was the forms of punishment and who should be punished in what way. And as Mihir just mentioned, you know, one of the things was that Brahmins should not be awarded the death penalty. This was upheld for some time. But even when the British had not actually even taken up power, we know that it was in the 1820s that there was a movement against sati. Now the narrative that Manoj Mitta takes up shows us that there are surprising figures who have taken up very ambiguous stands in relation to certain practices, caste practices as well as others. He mentions the question, you know, women come into this very early. One of the first things that mark a lower caste, and one of the issues over which cases were fought was the right of lower caste women who are lower in the caste hierarchy, to wear an upper garment. Then there was the practice of sati, and we find none other than Motilal Nehru defending the perpetrators of sati in a case where the strange argument is put forward by him as a lawyer that even though the woman was tied up and, the ghee was poured over her. Nobody actually set fire to it. It was spontaneous combustion. And so no one was actually guilty of killing the woman. So that, there are various kinds of things he takes up, and a certain history of legislation and litigation comes across very lucidly in this book, I think. And because he goes, at the same time he goes into detail and he gives a certain historical context. For example, when does the Indian Penal Code come into practice? It is drafted in the 1830s. The draft, then there was in 1829, of course, a law against sati, but it is again diluted. So all these kinds of backwards and forwards movements regarding customs, because of course the British have taken a position of not offending the upper castes who are in power. We have certain things like when the Presidency College, which was earlier called the Hindu College, was established in Calcutta, we find that male students from all castes are to be admitted. That itself was an important kind of milestone. So it goes on like this, that the question of property is very important, and caste comes into this in very strange ways because laws of inheritance are different for different castes. And so in the process of settling disputes over inheritance, when there have been legitimate and illegitimate children after a man dies, the question if he has had a liaison with a woman considered to be of lower caste, then what about her progeny? And this then brought up a question of various jatis claiming to be Kshatriyas, claiming to be Vaishyas, claiming to be part of the Chaturvarna system. At times, even when it suited them, claiming to be Shudras. But these guys, so the question of claims around caste and trying to fit this whole four Varna system into the language of the law. And I think this is where a question of that caste pride, on the one hand, the Brahmins did not want to allow anybody to contest their unique position in the caste hierarchy. So there are declarations that there are only two castes, the Brahmins and the Shudras. And so many of the intermediate castes then want to claim their Kshatriya status or their Vaishya status. And this was the case with the Kayasthas, it was the case with the Lingayats later on. Though the Lingayats are a community who are formed out of a rebellion against the caste system itself. But later on, the Lingayats are regarded as a caste. And I know I have come across some of my colleagues in Aurangabad say, Lingayats are almost like Brahmins. And they have claimed a caste status. So it's very interesting that claiming Kshatriya status, which gives you a place, of pride in the caste hierarchy. This is where, the history, even though many people belonging to these castes may not be aware of this history as such, it forms a part of a kind of collective caste ethos, which is still very much alive today, I think. And it just struck me actually while reading this book. One of the things I've been thinking about is that now that there is a lot more writing about caste, much of it is of course in the Indian languages, not all of it reaches into English language, but So there are different accounts of the whole colonial period and the whole struggle against the British power as well, which I think, I talk about when we, when we transit to a better society, we don't want to go back to what was even before a certain kind of very unpleasant regime took over. We don't want to necessarily go back to the way NCERT textbooks were being written. We have to go further than that. And we have to find new heroes. I think, Manoj Mitta has indicated some of the heroes, interesting heroes like S.K. Bole, who, on the one hand, he was one of the first to try and bring the right to use water in public places as a law when he was legislator in the period when the British had opened up a certain amount of governance power to Indians. And later on also he was responsible for drawing up a law on health. And he was from the Bhandari caste, which is something I learned from Manoj Mitta's book. Among the OBCs, who many of them today are supporters of a regime which very much wants to preserve caste hierarchy, they should be reminded of the progressive parts of their own history. The caste that I was born into, which is called CKPs, who were, many of them were scribes even in the regime of Shivaji and later. They also claimed the status of being Kshatriyas. But what is interesting is that there were many CKPs who were with Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar when he was, fighting for the right for Dalits to use the water of the Chaudhar reservoir in Mahad. And when that whole protest, that whole satyagraha was organized, there was Anantrao Chitre and Tipnis, who were CKPs who supported Babasaheb. And even in R.B. More's autobiography, which I translated, there is an interesting story that R.B. More, even though he got very good marks in his primary school exams, he was not admitted to the high school in Mahad. And it was actually the grandfather of Prabodhankar Thackeray, who is the grandfather of Uddhav Thackeray, who called the boy, dictated to him what should be written on a postcard, and sent to a local newspaper saying that this boy, even though he has shown academic merit, is not being admitted to a school run by Brahmins. Then they did admit him, though of course he had to undergo certain humiliations. But it is, these are all castes. In today's ethos, the upper among them would want to identify with Brahmins, or they would be upholders of a certain form of Hinduism which respects the caste hierarchy. And we have to think of these different heroes when we are reconstructing our society again. I think we have to start thinking of that reconstruction from now. We have to start writing books like Manoj's book. We have to start writing them in English as well as the regional languages. And, build up. If history is being erased, written history is being erased, we have to rewrite it better. We don't just have to bring back what was written and has been erased. We have to dig into the blind spots of our historiography. And this complex kind of struggle against caste, which is talked about in Manoj's book, is a part of what has to come. You know, we talk about Mahatma Phule, but the whole revolutionary nature of what he did, you know, starting a school for girls and then admitting girls of all castes to that school. It was later on that the British thought of starting schools for girls. So in the mid-19th century, we have a person who is from what is considered a Shudra caste, you know, the Maris, even though he was not economically of the poorest, and he did have the resources to do this, but it was an extremely bold step to start a school of that kind, and even the attempts by Vidyasagar in Bengal come later than that. So this is the complex kind of story of struggles against caste and the kinds of position that people who are known to be social reformers took up. You know, M.G. Ranade, who always has been counted among the liberals, who opposed Tilak in on many issues and was all for social reform. In 1857, he gave a ruling, he advocated that Brahmins should have the sole right to perform weddings and other rituals. No, and even if a wedding was carried out officiated by somebody else, the Brahmins still had a right to claim this. Now, these are the kind of arguments that come, and if you read carefully through this book, some of the language in this book is very interesting. You know, in what way we talk about caste, in what way we talk about caste identity, and how this is then framed in legal language. And it's a very intricate thing to legislate and on the matter of caste and to carry out litigation and to judge cases fought on questions of caste. So this translation of a social inequality and a hierarchy and the prevalent understanding of the justification of this kind of inequality, to translate it into legal language. I came across something when I was in Delhi just now, something similar in terms of gender, which I thought that there is a parallel here. You know, for many years the women's movement has been talking about the invisibility of women's work, especially in the house. After many years of fighting for this, recently the ILO has started a program of figuring out how to use time use studies as a supplement to the usual kind of national accounts, you know, measurement of the GDP, which asks about work outside the house, remunerative work, and it is remunerative work which is counted in the GDP in the economy, whereas work done in the house and in agricultural households, there is a great, difficult to draw the line between housework and productive work and so on. So one thing a practice which was started many decades ago, I know of people who were doing it in the 1990s in India, time use study about how, what a person is actually doing from the time they get up in the morning to the time they go to bed at night, which then reveals the actual participation of men and women in work. What I found interesting is that now trying to include this and kind of make it complementary to the usual ways of counting income and national income has run into similar kinds of problems. Because who are the enumerators? Who goes into a household to find out how the day is divided and what work is done. Who are your respondents? Will the wife speak honestly about this if the husband is present, and so on? You know, it's a similar kind of thing where that the accepted, traditionally accepted division of labor between men and women in the household, if you try and now bring it into the language of economics, you run into problems. Similarly, a deeply entrenched division of society on the lines of caste, which is religiously sanctioned, which is deeply in the consciousness of people, to bring it into the courts is one way of dealing with it. But that is an exercise which is fraught, you know, with the prejudices of judges, the ways that lawyers seek to frame their arguments on all these things. So anyway, there are many heroes. One unlikely hero of the anti-caste kind of struggles is Sardar Vittalbhai Patel, you know, who as early as 1919 apparently tried to enact a law that allowed intercaste marriage as a form of Hindu marriage, you know, and this comes much later in the Hindu Code Bill that that Baba Saheb Ambedkar proposed in 1947, and of course, though the Hindu Code Bill was sort of shot down in Parliament and Ambedkar resigned, these laws did come in later on. And what Manoj Mitta talks about, you know, 4 kinds of anti-caste legislations regarding personal laws, you know, marriage, adoption, divorce, guardianship, inheritance, all these matters. Again, these are very much, you know, embroiled in the whole mindset of gender and caste which we live with. The second part of this book, of course, goes to the post-independence period and is talking much more directly about violence. And I think there is a link, you see, between the kind of issues which are dealt with in the first part of the book, which are not all of them concerned with out and the worst form of violence, but which go to show that caste is endemic in society and is endemic to the way we think about ourselves and our relation to others. And then this part where he takes up certain very notorious cases in the post-independence period, starting with the Kilvenmani massacre in Tamil Nadu in 1964, and going through various cases which, without exception, the mass murderers are acquitted, and the kind of arguments which are put forward. So I think you have to read the book in order to understand the details of these arguments. But one thing that struck me, you know, just that very often the act of acquitting the accused also involves casting aspersions on the testimony of eyewitnesses. And Dalit eyewitnesses who have actually seen the massacre take place before their eyes and have somehow survived are in the courts, their testimony is not believed. They are considered to be liars. Yeah? And it somewhere then recalled to my mind much of the colonial literature which talks about Indian natives as being congenital liars, you know, which again I'm sure came up in many cases, but also comes up in the kind of, you know, the Orientalist view of native society. So a kind of replication of how the British looked at the colonized and how those in power in the courts, who may not all of them I mean, many of them and most of them in the highest levels of power are upper caste, but very often, even where there have been people of the Shudra and Dalit castes in positions, they have not really gone very far away from this kind of norm. And to think of the victims as being likely to imagine what has happened, even when there is all kinds of very clear evidence that a massacre has taken place. And this has been repeated so many times. It's interesting that Manoj Mitta talks about the Belchi case when Indira Gandhi, at the time she was not in power, having been defeated in 1977, actually visited the site of a caste atrocity and was the first kind of national level leader to have done this. And the kind of conversation and the kind of alarm that this case generated in the newspapers and the media of that time did actually have an impact all over India. And we find that the 1980s is a turning point. You know, we know about Mandal, of course. We know about the positions taken up by VP Singh. But there is a kind of building up of Dalit assertion particularly. This begins to show a certain kind of change. And then there are also some different kinds of verdicts delivered in the courts, which at least now are willing to admit that violence has taken place. And the violence is of the worst kind. The last chapter, of course, talks about how even when convictions take place, he mentions two cases. The one I am more familiar with is, of course, Khairlanji, which took place in Maharashtra on 29th September of 2006, when 4 members of the Bhotmange family were murdered, and it was a horrific case of gang rape and murder carried out by a crowd of villagers. Again, the story of how this was covered up and how it was kept from the media for a long time, and all these things are just as awful to think about. But even when some of the perpetrators, and were convicted, the courts took pains to deny that this was any kind of a caste atrocity. They tried to say that it was a property dispute of some kind. So, first of all, the courts deny culpability in the case of massacres. And secondly, even if culpability is admitted to say that it had nothing to do with caste. So these are the kind of reactions we find after independence, after we have abolished untouchability in the constitution, and yes, okay. And in 1989, it was found necessary to enact the anti-atrocity law, even though the constitution had provided a certain protection. And we find that continuously throughout these 70, 80 years, violent attacks on Dalits go on, and behind this, there is a complex reality of caste pride. I think that's where I should stop.